Welcome to another exciting episode of the NIDS View, a weekly show of the National Institute for Deterrence Studies, where we are advancing peace, promoting stability, and helping you to think deterrence. Each week, we discuss and analyze a recent topic and provide insight into how it affects our national deterrence. We hope you enjoy this show.
Welcome back to the NIDS View, a podcast of the National Institute for Deterrence Studies, where we like to talk about current issues of the day that related to the nuclear enterprise writ large and some of the key strategic topics that matter to us and to the American people. Now, today our topic is one that we just so happened to come across because we were scrolling through LinkedIn and, of course, the Federation of American Scientists, and, it's just one of the large disarmament groups, was advertising a new video they've made in which they criticize sole authority. Of course, that is the president's authority to launch a nuclear weapon. And of course, it doesn't take an act of Congress to do that. It doesn't take a declaration of war. It takes the president and the president alone. And we thought that the video that they've created, not only is it leaves out, the decision-making process writ large, it sort of misconstrues how that process happens, what goes into it left of launch. And so we thought we would have a discussion so that you, the listeners, would have a better understanding of sole authority. And of course, if the Federation of American Scientists, if anybody from that organization would like to come on the podcast and have an open discussion, we don't bite, we don't throw rocks, we don't do any of that stuff. So if they'd ever like to come on and have a discussion, we would be glad to have them on. So they're welcome anytime. Now, Curtis, Jim, welcome, of course. You both watched the video and, you sort of saw the challenges with it. Let me kick it to you first, Jim. How did you, as you watch this video, and you're the technical guy, and as the technical guy, we're always looking for your insights into why we might do things for very specific technical reasons. You were also an Army FA-52, and you were a guy who once launched nuclear artillery. And so now you've never been a president.
I'm not sure you ever launched it.
Well, that was your job.
That was really an overstatement and a very large generalization, Adam. But
he may have dropped one on his foot at some point, but I'm not sure he actually launched one.
When you consider as a private, what I did is I opened a box and pulled out a blue training round and said, this might be the thing we're using. I'm not sure that really counts, but yeah. Okay, Adam, whatever you may say. Thanks. And let me echo Adam. I would love to have some folks come on that would challenge us in our view and also open our audience's view on different ideas related to nuclear weapons and their implementation or employment, but also their value as part of our national security strategy for maintaining peace, because I think that's the one thing that we want to always go back to. So thanks for the pass over here, passing it over to me, Adam. Yeah. So first of all, from a technical issue, let's be honest. This is, in my opinion, this is not a technical question. This is really a question of, command and control of a weapon. It has great military value in keeping the peace, and also has great consequences if used either improperly or wantonly, etc. And so when I looked at the video, I did watch the video. In my opinion, it's somewhat misleading. I remember at one point they show, they're talking about the president's authority to launch, and they show someone flipping a key, and all of a sudden all these weapons are being launched from everywhere, like you're starting your automobile, which we'll hear Curtis, because he's been in that arena there. But my main question that goes out to the audience is, if we are first of all, sole use, sole authority given to the president means that the president does have the authority, the sole authority. No one else can grant that authority in the United States. So giving authority doesn't mean he could just willy-nilly launch weapons, like wakes up some morning and accidentally, and I've seen this in a cartoonish movie one time where you wake up and he hits a button, thinks it's an alarm, but it's actually the nuclear weapons, and all of them fly around. These kind of silly things are not happening. You will notice in the entire lifetime of the United States, with all the many weapons that we've had and the various presidents and the various presidential authorities that have been granted, we've never had this happen. No one's ever accidentally bumped the button or dropped the football. Someone one time said of a certain president, like, oh no, if they drop the football, then they, launch all these weapons. This is just clowny. And so I want to get to really the heart of this. And that is, what is an important aspect of this authority, and why is it granted? And so I'll pass it on to Curtis here, but here's my two thoughts. One is, do we want the president to not have the authority, and someone who, I don't know, we'll just talk about a crazy person. Let's talk about, I don't know, the leader of North Korea wakes up some morning and hits that button and away they fly. Do we want the president to have to make some phone calls and go through his Rolodex and then make another phone call and go to another place and get the authority to decide whether we're going to do anything about it, or, of course, doubt for the head of the North Korea to really do that? But what about the president, let's say, of, I don't know, Russia, to do that and launch weapons? Do we want to wait and tell and forecast to our adversaries, oh, we're going to, send out a newsletter and, put it on the Pony Express and, have all these authorities? Are we going to grant the authority and have the ability to allow the president to do that? And then, second of all, does anyone really think that the president, on a prepared, lead up to battle, lead up to a fight, whether we're not going to be discussing such things among our Joint Chiefs of Staff and among our other members of our cabinets to be able to make sure that when we have this time that we might need to launch, that we would do so? I mean, both of those ends have to be covered in this authority. And I think it's really an interesting concept to think that we wouldn't grant that authority to someone to say, we got to be able to make that decision in last second. If there is a last second, I'm going to turn it over to Curtis because he's sort of been in that command center. I've done it from an artillery standpoint. Now I'll agree that we talked about, crossing the Fulda Gap, my battle. We were, by that time, we were knee deep in, mud and artillery and tanks. And so the launch of a nuclear weapon seemed like the next plausible thing to stop the Russian hordes from crossing the Fulda Gap, as we used to say. Curtis, take us there.
Tanks, you're welcome. I would say this, separate from what Private Petrosky had to worry about in 1979, I want to just first make a couple of comments on the video itself that the Federation of American Scientists produced. I'm not going to really try to push or advertise this thing, but I will tell you that it is a video that utilizes something that I call it's designed to aware and scare. It uses the idea of awareness, i.e., some sort of education, but it really has a purpose of scaring the viewer, and also it is somewhat politically slanted in how the video is projected when it analyzes the presidents. And so I'll leave that to the viewer if they decide to go look at that. But what I want to talk about here is that, to your point, Jim, if you're not going to have a sole authority, what's the alternative, right? Well, it's a community, a party. It was believed maybe sometime in the Cold War that there were more than one person who could direct a nuclear attack. Heck, I wonder what LeMay thought he could do and couldn't do in the privacy of his own office. But I would say that the sole authority decision is historically precedent, not only in the United States, but in all the nuclear powers. I can't tell you a nuclear power that I'm aware of that has someone other than the national leader that's the decision maker. There might be one that has a military shared decision. I'm not going to specify which one that is, but it's not one of the big five that you might have to think about. And so when it comes down to sole authority, it really comes down to let me start from here. So as Adam and I have written over the years, we sort of coined this phrase, detect, decide, and direct. And that the NC3 has this opportunity to detect the incoming attack, allow the leadership, the senior leaders, to decide what to do, right? And then to direct whatever that decision is. How do you get that out to the forces so the forces can move? Inside of those 3Ds, the detect, decide, and direct, is what I think are the three key elements, and that is time, authority, and decision. And that we have to be aware that time is of the essence when you're under attack, specifically a nuclear attack, right? It could be anywhere from 30 minutes to, something much smaller than that, 15 minutes or less. And so the time to make a decision is something that can be really constraining. You must have the authority. You've got to, at some point in time, have one person who, in the end, is the sole decider. Otherwise, a group of people seeking consensus in a short amount of time is almost an impossible task, given just human nature. And then finally, you got to have the decision, and so that authority has to be able to produce a decision, a learned decision, hopefully, and then that decision needs to be final, and the nation needs to move forward in whatever that decision is going to be. So time, authority, and decision are key in the nuclear decision-making process. And I know we're talking about sole authority, but we have to understand that if we're going to do something more than sole authority, you must account for the time demand that would cause, and then how do you get to that sole decision?
Yeah, Curtis. Well, the other thing I think of in terms of law, and I believe we talked about this just a few weeks ago, is when you do something by committee. I mean, let's face it. When committees make decisions and then something goes awry, everyone has everyone else to blame, and no one's held responsible. The absolute responsibility that's placed on the president, in my view, is similar to sort of the self-regulating way in which nuclear weapons are employed. Because they are so destructive, we are absolutely cautious about employing them. And apparently our adversaries are too. I mean, there are other people that have the capability and the weapons that can be launched. They don't, because if they do that, the absolute response to that is going to be horrible. Now, one would say the same thing is true of the absolute authority. If I know that my decision that I make will be scrutinized and I will be held accountable to the world population for a decision that I solely make, and I can't blame Curtis or Adam for making it with me, then that gives you the pause to make sure that you are absolutely right in applying that decision. I mean, don't you see that from a legal authority standpoint, Curtis?
Well, I think that's more of a moral authority in my position as I look at this, is that you're going to wrestle with those demons of any sort of nuclear decision. I think the problem here is that we don't ask our senior leaders to practice this decision-making process. It's one thing to have a sole authority, but if your sole authority is never forced, even in a rehearsal, to make a decision under pressure, you can almost assuredly count on that decision being very difficult to come by. You can read numerous accounts on the open internet about the nuclear war games that Putin plays in, and he's probably made decisions to nuke different countries and even America on numerous occasions. It's almost automatic for him in that regard, and so something that should be I don't want to say of concern in the sense, but it should be of note that of those nations with those nuclear nations who rehearse or have to think about making that decision by their sole authority, we may be one of the least rehearsed in all of that.
Well, Curtis, and I appreciate you bringing it up. Sorry, Adam, I jumped you again, but that's where I was leading is one piece is to say we have that sole authority and we talk about it and we bring it up in this article. So it's valuable to do that and certainly for our audience. But the second piece is how do you practice it? How often do you practice it? And how do you evaluate that? And I do go back to the law. You know, I was looking through some other articles today, and there's a lot about, what about international law? What about what we would do if someone did violate the U.S. law or an international law in the use or, employment of nuclear weapons. And that I understand it plays a role. And you're right. It's moral authority because after the nuclear weapons are launched, a lot of bets are off because we've not really been there before. But, who knows what authority will happen there. But I do think that somewhat that has to be practiced. We have to understand that. And everyone within the national and international community has to understand that practice as part of that. And you're right. Putin probably practices, who knows, on a daily basis. I don't know. I worry about that.
So,
Adam?
The way I looked at this, it was only a 5-minute video, so it's not all that long, but it's just enough to give enough disinformation that somebody walks away completely misled in how this works. And so, I had really 3 basic problems. First, they say that sole authority was designed for the Cold War and that it is a Cold War relic. It's no longer applicable, which, that might, let's say, the V8 was designed, the V8 engine was designed during the Cold War, and we still have V8 engines. Therefore, they must be a Cold War relic because, the Cold War's over and we still have them. That's kind of a stupid argument. The fact that the Cold War is over doesn't fundamentally change the fact that there are nuclear armed adversaries that wish harm to the United States and that the United States maintains a nuclear arsenal in order to deter and, if need be, defeat those adversaries. That doesn't change with the end of the Cold War. So it's not a Cold War relic. That's sort of a false assertion. The second thing it says is that nobody, not the legislature, not the courts, not anybody, can stop a nuclear launch because that would be treason. Now, that is a half truth. Because the simple fact is that in 1947, President Truman authorized sole authority. That's when this was developed, was in 1947, after the use of the nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And they said, hey, because they're doing this for the first time. And they said, hey, we've got to figure out how we're going to employ these weapons and how we're going to maintain control. Because for those that may not know, the very first authorization to use those weapons in Japan came from the Chief of Staff, General Handy of the U.S. Army. And it was a letter that was sent to General Spots, who was the commander of 20th Air Force. And that letter said, after this date, and I think it was like August 5th, something like that. After this date, you can employ the nuclear weapons you have. And that was the authorization. And so, of course, you develop this capability over time. Now, what's interesting and what they don't talk about is that since 1945, the U.S. Congress has never said, hey, we're going to pass legislation. And in that legislation, we're going to set out the terms and conditions under which nuclear weapons can be used. They've had 70 plus years in which they could stipulate who can launch it, under what conditions it can be launched. And Congress has always chosen not to do that. And the president is often a member of the opposition party. How often have Democrats controlled Congress, but there was a Republican president? And those Democrat Congresses still chose not to do anything. So this idea that the president has this authority and nobody can do anything about it is just it's misinformation. Congress, and you've got a couple of bills, Curtis, that where individual members of Congress who don't like sole authority have written bills, and then those bills have gone nowhere because they have no support in Congress. So Congress plays a critical role in this, and the critical role they play is that they purposefully choose never to limit or constrain the president's sole authority. That's playing a role. So the idea that it's treason. Now, there's the second part of that is also the chain of command. And the point of the chain of command is that under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, no officer is required to undertake an unlawful order. And of course, determining whether an order is lawful or not is up to each individual officer. And so therefore, at any point, now, if you choose to disobey a direct order, you very well may be prosecuted under the UCMJ, but you may not, because if it's an unlawful order, then the expectation in this country is that you do not obey an unlawful order. And so that those are two constraints and two, sort of limitations on this and actual approvals. Congress says this is how we want it. They've had 70 years to make it otherwise. And then the third,
go ahead.
The third problem I have is they say it is too simple to launch, and therefore we need a more deliberative process. That's a specific statement they make. And the simple fact is that is total and utter horsepucky. This is not a simple process. This process starts years left of launch because U.S. Strategic Command has to, there's a whole process that the intelligence community, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, U.S. Strategic Command, the Joint Staff, where they plan all the targeting, they do all the assessments, they do all the analysis, they plan sets of targets, they come up with operational plans for a variety of targets. Those get approved. Those then become, the operational plan. And then all of those targets are, we can't really discuss them in detail. So right. we're going to be vague here, but those plans are enacted. And then of course the president doesn't play war games. We haven't had a president who's played war games in decades. So when that terrible, fateful day comes and the president a presidential decision conference is called and the president is notified that there are weapons inbound, and then the president's going to get advice from the STRATCOM commander, from the Secretary of Defense, and then they're going to try to make a decision on what to do. So the president doesn't just say, give me the briefcase, the football, as we call it. The Russians call it the Cheget. But, he's not going to just get that and start launching weapons. Yeah. There's a very detailed, the Department of Defense practices this whole process all the time, even though the president does it. So the president, if he just wanted to sort of make a decision on his own, he would have no clue what to do. He would have to absolutely have the total and complete participation of the nuclear command and control system. And that's lots of people. And there's years of decision-making, planning, and practicing that go into that so that when that fateful day happens, they can progress through that process in a rapid fashion. So the idea that it's not very complex, the president can do it whenever he wants, it's just not, it doesn't work that way.
Yeah. And there's another piece of this, Adam, and I appreciate bringing up Congress. And that, again, when you talk about a last second decision, okay, that's one possibility, but probably the least realistic view of where we are. And then there's the peaceful development of plans and execution of those contingency planning, et cetera, that is all part of that planning process. But if we're saying that we do not have enough trust in our leaders, and I say in our leaders writ large, and I know politics is politics, but let's be realistic. So far, none of this has ever happened or even gotten close to happening. And we don't trust our leaders, our laws, and our Constitution, which also includes, by the way, the 25th Amendment, which if Congress wants to, can remove a president that they really, truly believe is going to wake up and for some reason, somehow wrestle the nuclear football, whatever you want to call it, out of the, hands of some burly, officer that's standing there with it. I mean, let's be for real. This is, again, it's somewhat of a comical view. It's sort of like, I don't know if you remember the movie about the nuclear warfare where the kids break into a computer system and they're playing war games on a computer and they launch the weapons.
War games?
Whatever. I mean, it's just nonsense to think that if truly people think we are at that position, NIDS has a lot more work to do, and we need people to help us, by, working with us and donating to us and providing support to us to get the public aware, because we're not even close to that horrible situation. The last thing before Curtis jumps in here, and I just want to say I picked it up from you, is the fact that all three people on this podcast apparently are Cold War relics based on your definition. So I just thought I'd pass that on.
Well, at least I'm still useful. Well, let's talk about one of those bills. So after President Biden was elected, within a couple of months, it actually made some controversy. A letter was sent February 22nd of 21. So this would have been a month after inauguration. A letter was sent to President Biden from two Democrat congresspeople, Congressman Panetta and Congressman Liu, I think both of California, asking the president to basically allow some potential changes to his sole authority, position.
They don't need to ask him. They can just pass legislation.
They certainly could. And I'll talk about that in a moment. And they asked him to do things like require additional officials in the line of presidential succession, starting with the vice president and the speaker of the House, who would have to first concur with a launch order. And then they also asked requiring that the launch order would require certifications from the Secretary of Defense and the chairman, a concurrence from the chairman that the launch order was valid. And then requiring a congressional declaration of war and specific authorization from Congress before any nuclear first strike can be conducted. But for all of you people out there who are going, oh, but they're just talking about first strike. Of course, a first strike would be something that is, we would be initiating that attack. If you look at the Senate bill entitled the Restricting First Use of Nuclear Weapons Act of 2023, I don't believe there's a 24 version of this. It's just a 4-page bill as you print it out. And it kind of goes through some interesting statements in here. It notes that the constitutional powers of the president as the commander in chief to introduce armed forces into hostilities or into situations where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated in the circumstances exercised only pursuant to 3 situations. 1, a declaration of war. 2, a specific statutory authorization, think AUMF, authorization to use military force, or those sorts of things. And then the 3rd would be a national emergency created by an attack upon the United States, its territories, possessions, or the armed forces. Now, we would, in the Cold War, this was basically a nuclear attack, right? Now it could mean a cyber attack or something else. But that's not clarified. And then here they talk about a first-use nuclear strike carried out by the United States would constitute a major act of war. And then therefore, a first strike conducted absent of a declaration of Congress would violate the Constitution, is how they're describing it in here. Now, what's interesting, though, is their definition in the bill of what is a first-use nuclear strike. Okay, and that is defined as an attack using nuclear weapons against an enemy that is conducted without the Secretary of Defense and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff first confirming to the president that there has been a nuclear strike against the United States. Okay, so what they're saying here is, in this bill, is they first of all want to eliminate any legal use of potential use of launch on warning, in that you would not be able to launch your weapons in retaliation unless and until there were nuclear mushroom clouds over the United States or its possessions, visible, under this bill. And so so this really removes the ability of the president to affect any sort of deterrence with a threat of retaliation before you destroy all of our nuclear stuff in place. And if you're on the receiving end of those first strikes, vote accordingly if you survive. And so think through how that might be. And so really these requests to change the rules under trying to take advantage of a Democratic president, a Democrat Party president, in the hopes of changing the law, the rules, however you want, 75 years of precedent, in an effort to do what they couldn't do in the first 75 years. This is, in my opinion, really an act of contrition or to the disarmament community. This is just a desire to make America's use of its nuclear arsenal harder, to constrain our ability to affect deterrence, to affect a threat. And that's what's important here to note. The sole authority, while difficult in an attack, because you've got to track the succession, everybody needs to know what to do, because they've never practiced it, and these sorts of things, how to, in the worst of days, that is difficult enough. But then having to force additional approvals by people who may not exist anymore after the first strike is all but saying, we don't want to retaliate. We don't want the threat of retaliation, and therefore we're not interested in effective deterrence.
Yeah, now I want to throw up my my technical hand, because there's another piece that sort of is interesting in 2024 that we're talking about this instead of 1948, and that is that the time, with hypersonic weapons and space weapons, the time to make a decision is so incredibly reduced. You would think we are going the other direction, that we would want to have a faster response time in order to ensure that the adversary understands, again, deterrence. We would bring about that fear that whatever they did, it will be met with even worse response than what they expected. And we don't see that. I mean, this whole decision about presidential authority goes all the way back to, I'm going to dig at Adam here, because it goes all the way back to the Civil War era, when, there was question about whether Lincoln had the authority, if he saw if he saw some sort of actions by the South in their uprising, Adam, that, in the Civil War, I know you call it something else, but anyway, that he had the authority to do this. And the Supreme Court talked about it back then, because he needed to have the authority to be able to make decisions to an existential threat to, at the time, our republic. And we still have to look at that as being a possibility.
So we are just about out of time, but one thing I'm going to take the last minute to say, is that let's not forget that it is only the President of the United States who is elected by the American people.
That's right.
The Chairman of the Joint Chiefs is not, the Secretary of Defense is not, the Speaker of the House, the Senate Majority Leader.
Great point.
They're not elected by the American people. Depending on, whether you like, let's go back to, Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi elected one of the most liberal districts in the entire country that was not representative of the rest of the country. Now, you could take the current Speaker of the House and you could sort of say he represents one of the most conservative and religious districts in the country. And for those that are in California or New York, you say, hey, that's not me. So your speaker is likely to not be particularly representative of the people. And a military officer who's a 4-star general is certainly not representative of the thinking of the people, nor is a Secretary of Defense who is, in most cases, a creature of Washington and has spent an entire career in Washington. They're not representative of the people. But the President of the United States has specifically and directly been elected by the people. And so therefore, he and he alone is able to say, I represent the will of the people, and here's what I'm going to do. Nobody else can. And so
I want to just echo that and just maybe say it's the will of the majority of the people in the Electoral College. But let me say this, to your point, is that deterrence hinges on the fear by the adversary and the perception by the adversary that they cannot beat the NC2, NC3 system, that they cannot beat the decision authority. So it has to be faster. And to Jim's argument, Adam, you and I have written years and years over attack time compression and what technology is doing to compress that amount of time that the president has to make these decisions. And so we need to be finding ways to make it faster. I commend to the audience our various articles on America Needs a Dead Hand and the follow-up article that came out this year, America Needs a Dead Hand Now Even More, as one possible thought as to how to deal with this challenge. But the answer to this isn't to further diffuse the decision authority. We must continue to focus it and streamline it and make it more relevant. Otherwise, the decision to retaliate is likely going to come from the 8th or 9th person in succession, and it'll be your Secretary of Education who,
is now the president.
And they're making the decision to retaliate with the few things we may have left after we've waited so long to validate things have become mushroom clouds across the Midwest. And that's, to me, and to the American people, a bit too late, in my humble opinion.
All right. Well, we are out of time, so I'm going to cut you guys off. Here, let me go ahead and cut the mics. Of course, I want to thank Jim and Curtis for coming on and having a nice discussion. Thanks to you, the listeners, for joining us. As you know, if without you, the NIDS View is nothing. It's just us talking to ourselves. So thanks for being here. Of course, check out the website. Check out Global Security Review. There's a HUSI event coming up, so you could sign up for that. We'll have Frank Miller to talk about the future. We've got this podcast. We've got the Nuclear Knowledge podcast, this Real Space Strategy, Deterrence Down Under that you get to take from our Australian colleagues. There's just so much you can do. We're almost like 20th Century Fox or Paramount. We're like a huge, entertainment opportunity. But we just focus on nuclear entertainment. Infotainment. There we go.
There's hundreds of people we employ.
So make sure you do that. Make sure you'll check out Curtis on the Twitter. I'm handling your Global Security Review. So check out our new articles. Are coming up Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday. That's when we post new articles. So check that out. And of course, as always, we want to remind you to think deterrence.
Thank you for listening to the NIDS View. This show is produced under the NIDS Podcasting Network, a division of the National Institute for Deterrence Studies. NIDS is a 501c3 organization dependent upon donations to provide this podcast and bring about awareness of the peacekeeping value of U.S. strength and our national deterrence. You can catch all of our podcasts or provide feedback at thinkdeterrence.com. I would like to thank our producer, Kimberly Charrington, our sponsors, and all the fantastic members of the National Institute for Deterrence Studies for making this podcast possible. Stay tuned next week for another exciting and informative The NIDS View.